All right, good afternoon, everybody. We'll be starting in just a minute. Just going to give it a minute or two for folks to join the webinar. So we're just going to give it to probably one or two or three after, just to get folks time to join, and we'll start the webinar shortly.
Wow. Seeing some old familiar faces in this meeting right now. Very exciting.
Yeah, and welcome everybody. We'll get started in just another minute, just giving folks some time to join. And for folks who just joined, we're just giving everyone just a minute or two to join the webinar, and then we'll get started. All right. Thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Bryan Cowan. I'm a product manager here at Fortress. We're going to be talking about understanding software risks in your supply chain. So just a quick intro about myself. I work on our software supply chain products and services. I used to work on our R&D team, and now I work on making software supply risk data relevant and actionable. A few housekeeping notes. You can send in questions at any time in our meeting. There's a little button at the top that says Q&A. So feel free to type any questions in there. We'll try to answer them as we go. Um, Additionally, today's meeting will be recorded and we'll be sending the recording to all attendees as well as a copy of the slide deck. So we'll give you the slides and the recording at the end. So thanks again for joining us for those folks who just joined. Today, I'm joined by our very special guest on this webinar. We've got Tom Pace with us. He's the co-founder and CEO of NetRise, a company that we partner with, who we think has some of the most innovative capabilities for firmware and code analysis. So I'll hand it over to Tom to introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Really excited about doing this with you guys and excited about the partnership in general. I think it's a really great opportunity to have an end-to-end supply chain, security visibility solution that's driven by what you guys are doing and what we are doing. So, some of my background that is, I think, relevant. I spent a number of years at the Department of Energy doing ICS security, and then at Cylance, worked on a lot of the problems that we're solving now in a very manual way. And now we've basically taken to automating a lot of those most difficult problems. And so the partnership that we have with Fortress is really awesome. It's been a real pleasure working with you guys and the team. So looking forward to this and much more to come.
All right, thank you, Tom. So I'm going to start with a quick agenda. So we're going to start with an overview of software and device risk. The software you might be interested in tracking could be something that's running on a laptop that manages sensitive data, or it could be running on a device that talks to, let's say, your industrial control system network. After that, we're going to talk about why software supply chain security is important, what are the challenges, how you can get better transparency into your software, and what to do once you have that data. We also have a life cycle of 5 use case examples of how to use software transparency information, like software bills of materials with procurement and contracting, vulnerability management, change management, and incident response. And I've got Q&A listed last, but please feel free to ask questions as we go. We do have the Q&A section where you can type in your questions, but feel free to stop us at any point and put questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring and try to answer as we go. So starting with software and device risk, Software supply chain attacks have been increasing for years. Organizations have been good about securing their own data, their networks, and stopping attackers from a frontal assault. So attackers have changed tactics. We all have third-party software and devices that we depend on for our business operations. So attackers have moved to trying to compromise that software and bypass those frontline defenses and come in through a side door. So the software running these critical functions can be a black box. We don't know what the components are or what it's made of. In modern software development, you're writing code, but you're also taking bits and pieces and open source modules and assembling them to get what you need. So we're putting a lot of trust in these components running in our environment. And since we don't know um, like what they are, we're putting a lot of trust in our vendors and asking them to track the vulns and make sure that they're not using old or vulnerable versions of the software. But we found that many vendors may not be good at tracking or reporting known vulnerabilities in public databases like NVD. So Tom, I'll see if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a few things driving this problem. The first one is you have just a exponential growth in the number of devices that are being utilized by organizations. And there's, just a very important business decision here that companies have to make, right? The concept secure to market is not really a term. The concept of time to market is. And so you have this misaligned set of incentives, at least currently, where getting things into the market is the primary objective. And that, of course, makes sense for the overwhelming majority of organizations. However, what we've found is due to the nature and the maturity of a lot of the solutions that are operating on the enterprise proper, attackers are pivoting their their threat and attack models to go after things that maybe don't have as many layers of defense. So if you want to get into an environment and get on an endpoint, like that requires you navigating a number of pretty good security solutions these days. But if you want to compromise an externally facing router, switch, VPN, firewall, like what's protecting that? So even though we've had this explosive growth of devices entering the market, we have not had a commensurate amount of security solutions to address the risk and volume of those devices. And what that has now created is an opportunity for attackers to leverage that gap in solutions for these devices. So basic things like continuous monitoring and continuous risk assessments and finding vulnerabilities in this whole new class of devices is not really something that solutions are available for in many respects. And also just one other thing on this piece is as a result, we've begun to see a number of these attacks happening, right? And I think we're going to talk about a number of those today. So
apologies. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, those are some of those important challenges there, and I'm glad to hear the context of what you guys have been seeing as well. So on solutions, so some solutions that can help are analysis of source code and compiled code. Analysis of compiled code can tell you about components and misconfigurations. And using that knowledge of components, you can generate software bill of materials and do analysis of what you found. So, for example, you can understand the known vulnerabilities that are related to those components. A vendor may be tracking and reporting the vulns related to that top-level product itself, but that doesn't always mean they're doing that for all the components that make it up. Because those components, you can also know if they're up to date or if there's a new vulnerability that pops up for a widely used component. You can find if you're affected and what specific systems are affected by that new vulnerability. Tom, do you want to add anything here?
No, I mean, I think that's exactly right. The big problem we have here, which is where these solutions really find themselves most valuable, is around just providing visibility. So we talk a lot about vulnerability management and some of these other issues, those are second and third order problems, though. People tend to, conflate those two problems, saying like SBOMs and vulnerability management. It's like they're like the same thing, and they're not the same thing. One provides visibility, one is enrichment on that visibility. So that's a problem that's 2 or 3 steps into the future, frankly. So whenever organizations say things to me like, "Hey, this is a lot of vulnerabilities. Now we have a vulnerability management problem," and then I show them they have a component from 20 years ago. Is that a vulnerability management problem? Probably not. So we don't have data to make decisions. That's the problem, and so that's the big solution here, is now making decisions based on actual data, and those solutions just did not exist. Like, that's the problem. They just didn't exist, and now they do.
Yeah, that's a great point, which is that SBOMs and code analysis are giving you software transparency, and then it's up to you to figure out how to use that data in an effective way.
We'll give you lots
of
data.
Yeah, yeah, we'll give you lots of data, but cutting through the noise is definitely what's important. So next up, we're going to talk a little bit about software supply chain security, meaning what kind of data you can get using code and SBOM analysis. So we mentioned SBOMs, just a quick refresher. They come in standard formats. You can get data on components, who made the data, its name, version, identifiers like a Perl or CPE, and those sort of identifiers are what you can use to relate to data in security databases like NBD. You might also get data on relationships, which lets you know, is this component used at the top level or is it buried somewhere deeper, like 4 levels to low? I just want to call this out as this is what I've got on this slide is the minimum elements for an SBOM. So you can ask for more information and get more from a vendor or from code analysis. The important thing here is that unless you're, let's say you're talking to your supplier directly and asking for these things, some vendors may try to get away with just like the bare minimum here. Okay, so using this, we just discussed like what kind of data and how you could use it. So we want to cover a couple of areas of the kind of data you could get from code and SBOM analysis. So I've got 5 different points here that I'll cover briefly. We'll start with vulnerability analysis, and I'll hand it over to Tom to talk about this one.
Yeah, so we recognize that just giving somebody a giant, pile of vulnerabilities is not really the most helpful thing to do in the world. You have to give people other ways to prioritize those things and determine context as much as you possibly can. So, all the basic things around CVSS score and is it critical or is it high, and how old is a particular vulnerability, how old is a particular component, does it have what's the EPSS score, like what's the probability of this thing being exploited? And so we do all of those, like what I think are frankly relatively basic things, but then we do a significant amount of other enrichment that is not so basic. Enriching it in terms of like what exploits are actually available. We go and pull all of those in, and we break those into 3 categories for you. So unproven, proof of concept, and weaponized. Weaponized being obviously the most severe. And so that's a way where you can have 1,000 vulnerabilities that we potentially identify, and then whittle that number down to tens, right? Sometimes even less than that. And so what's also interesting is, based on the data that we've seen, a number of those vulnerabilities that have weaponized exploits, quite often rather, are not critical according to CVSS. And something that's really important about that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense, actually, when you think about it, approaching this from an attacker's perspective. Attackers know that vulnerability management programs overcompensate for critical vulnerabilities, right? The number of organizations I've talked to and worked with who say, hey, if we have a critical vulnerability, we have to patch that in 30, 60, 90 days, or it has to go through some other like risk management process. Okay, fine. Like that's not a bad policy, but just understand that that's not a secret, and that people are using that behavior against the entire industry right now. So they're writing exploits for vulnerabilities that are not criticals, because people are over-focused on patching critical vulnerabilities, which is why it's really important to bring in that additional enrichment to highlight that not all critical vulnerabilities are the ones you should necessarily be focusing on. Then we also bring in things like threat actors that are potentially going after specific vulnerabilities that might represent a particular interest in a vertical or organization type based on some of that data. We call out things that are on the CISA known exploitable vulnerabilities list. And then we kind of correlate all of this information as well. So say you have 10 devices or whatever uploaded into our platform or leveraging Fortresses as well, you can begin to make decisions like, okay, this vulnerability exists across these 20 devices. So if I fix this, I fix it on 20 devices uniquely, right? You can start to make those kind of decisions and have that additional context available to you, which right now just does not exist. So we're not just giving you, here's 1,000 vulnerabilities and we wish you well. We're giving you a lot of different tools and opportunities to prioritize these things. And I think what's even more important for most organizations is an opportunity to actually, revamp and take a second look at their vulnerability management program and build it in a way that makes more sense given the data that is available today.
Yeah, great. Excellent points, Tom. And next, we'll be talking about component health.
Yeah, so this is a giant problem. I feel like we could do an entire webinar just on this. But things like provenance, is this a proprietary component? Is this a well-known third-party component? Is this something that's typically found to be a dependency? This is all, additional context that can be provided in here. So being able to come in and identify all of the dependencies, all of the different, packages that are being used. We integrate in with, I don't know, something like 15 or 16 different package managers that also help in identifying components. We support multiple naming conventions, CPEs and PEARLs. We also call out something that I think is really important that kind of aligns here, which is around the idea of identifying, known unknowns as well. So just because there's a component that's here that we can't identify the version for, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? Just because it can't be identified because it's a proprietary or first-party code of a particular device or whatnot, that still needs to be tracked and understood. Because if something happens down the line where, this piece of first-party code from this vendor is being exploited, which happens, we need to be able to identify where else that component is in a machine-readable, very fast way. And that's what allows for that. So, all of the open source licensing and copyright and all that kind of stuff definitely matters. That tends to matter a lot more to the device manufacturer than the end user of the device for legal reasons and all of that. They could potentially have put something out there that they now need to give away for free, which they tend to not want to do.
Yeah, great points. Yeah, and the idea with this tree on the right side here is just to say this is from an actual open source project. And the idea is you see these color coded, and these are all vulnerable components. Like our red one is a severe one. And the idea is each one of these components in your software is a software product in its own. It has its own life cycle, its own bugs, different things that can affect whether your product is actually exploitable by something that you find. So another kind of data that you can get is provenance analysis. So this is where we can identify data on using information in the SBOM on the company or maybe the contributors that made the software. So for example, for a company or a legal entity like a software foundation, you can look up information on their ownership, location of their facilities, headquarters to look for where they might be developing their software or see if there's the potential for foreign influence. For open source components, since their development is out in the open, we can see who are the people that are contributing code to the project. Where do they live? Do they work for Huawei? Depending on your use case, that might be very important for you. This might factor into your use of a component or something that you pull into your own software. Many utilities or large companies, they might buy lots of stuff, but they do their own development too. So it's useful for you to know about where your software comes from if, let's say, you're providing services to the federal government. And this can also help you understand exposure from software from countries that have an adversarial relationship with the United States, before geopolitical events happen. And next up, we have a code analysis. So on code analysis, we're talking about misconfigurations here. So this can help you spot insecure coding practices or misconfigurations, like when you're looking through a binary, you might find that there's a weak hashing algorithm, or that there are insecure URLs used, or maybe there's overly permissive access to password files. In code analysis, you might also find that there are private keys stored in the software, or that there are invalid certificates. And it also helps you understand if there are binary protections being used to help prevent buffer overflows. We can also use this kind of data to look at hashes on the software. Component hashes can also help us identify if there's maybe a malicious file in there. And other pieces of information that we might find here that Tom already mentioned is component licenses. So if you're pulling in open source components into a software project, they generally have license terms. Many are very permissive, meaning you can do what you want with them. You can put them in a commercial product, you can sell them. But there are some that are not. Typically, I'll call them copyleft licenses, which means that you would, if you're using this software, and you make modifications, you have to publicly release them, or it prohibits you using them for commercial sale of a product or use in other closed source projects. All right, so next up, we're going to move to our use cases and lifecycle examples. So as a primer on this section, as a technical person, I love data. Data is great, but I'll say that we're all drowning in data, and it's important to be able to filter it and make it actionable for you. So I want to note some considerations in our life cycles here, which is that we always want to try to get the most accurate information to drive a positive impact on operations. The bottom line is here, we want to save everybody time and money while improving security. But having perfect SBOMs and transparency data is unlikely. Having source code is great, but generally a vendor's not going to share that with us for a couple of good reasons. But we can still do the best we can and get good data from compiled code. Additionally, SBOMs are a good way that you can do a trust but verify on a vendor. So some vendors like Cisco and others are starting to provide SBOMs that they've produced, but they can be imperfect, or they might include redactions, or maybe the vendor's only trying to give the minimum amount of information. So it's good to get those from them, but also you can make your own based on the software files you have, compare them, see what differs and where. And when it comes to this data, it's important to see the bigger picture, which is to say, which assets does this apply to? What's the risk rank of this asset? If I've identified a vulnerability that requires an update, which devices do I start with? Having that sort of information to be able to prioritize is important. And then at the bottom here, when we talk about fundamentals, SBOMs and code analysis are not a silver bullet, but they are a new tool which I think can be woven into your existing processes. Organizations have lots of different groups which can use this data in different ways to help with decision making on prioritization, could be used in negotiations, and support policies and controls. So the bottom line here is that transparency data can be used to help drive improvements to processes, and your literal bottom line. So this can be used to help you in better vendor selection, faster process execution, or help verify remediations. So I'm going to pass it over to Tom to talk about some more of our use cases in detail.
Yeah. So there's a number of ways in which SBOMs can be utilized. Here we're talking about it seems to be a pretty good left to right model in terms of along this continuum. So procurement and third-party risk is obviously a great opportunity, especially the bigger organization you are, the bigger stick you are going to have. So I've made a statement to a number of companies before, which is we really need you guys to the end users of the devices, that is, to kind of work with us to solve the problem for everyone, right? And the reason I say that is, I mean, you better believe that we're reaching out to all the device manufacturers we can. Like, it's obviously a very important kind of go-to-market function for us. However, that's just not scalable at this exact moment. So working with end users of these devices and leveraging the influence that they are able to have really creates a really awesome set of circumstances where rising tides kind of lifts all boats here. And so having visibility into these things is super helpful. I also think that most organizations don't believe that there is, influential back to the vendors as they are. We've seen a number of organizations that, they're not enormous organizations, but have influence over some of the issues that, we've been able to identify, which made them and all of their other customers more secure, which is obviously a great position to be in. So you can leverage this for contracting purposes and all of that. At the same time, right? Like I think the intention around really going after the device manufacturers almost in a wildly aggressive way is kind of going to fall, it's not going to hit the mark. It's not going to drive the right reasons to make the changes. To me, it should be much more around okay, now we have visibility. We want these things fixed, which are just, maybe particularly egregious, but we can't really expect people to just say okay, this kind of solution did not exist in the market until the last 18 to 24 months, and now we expect all of our devices to have zero vulnerabilities. Just that's a totally insane set of circumstances. It's probably never going to happen, and that's okay, right? We have risk management processes that allow us to make decisions based on having data. People oftentimes forget that there is a very important decision, and that is accepting the risk, right? But at least you now know about it. But you can use that as an influencing factor. Obviously, the vulnerability management piece, which we've kind of already talked about, not just giving you a list of vulnerabilities, but also presenting you with a number of ways to prioritize those vulnerabilities. You can also integrate these things in with other like asset inventory solutions that can give you in-environment context, right? So if you have a device with a remote code execution vulnerability that's, behind, let's just imagine it's air-gapped, even though most things aren't, even though people think they are. And then you have a device that's connected to the internet. Obviously, those are two totally different sets of environmental context. So that kind of stuff can also be helpful. Change management, being able to say, we're going to update these components either on these devices or on these cloud applications or on these just internal applications. You can start to see okay, why on every software artifact is this component 5 years older than everything else? Why is that? So you can't, those are questions and answers you can't ask yourself right now. And then the last one, which I think is probably the most practical, right this second, is the incident response use case. So the example that we just continuously use that, I look forward to using a different one day is around Log4j, right? But here's the crazy thing. Here's the really insane thing about that. We're getting brand new devices from device manufacturers that are pulling the vulnerable Log4j code still. It's still happening. So, I look forward to not talking about it, but until people start actually doing the right thing, I guess we're just going to keep doing it. So understanding, being able to answer the question, am I affected? And then where am I affected is basically impossible for most organizations right now. And if you can do it, let me tell you guys something, you should probably go sell that capability because those are really, really hard questions to answer from a software supply chain. And they're particularly difficult from a device level and firmware supply chain perspective. So being able to have faith and confidence in that and take this response into your own hands and not rely on the vendors is how we have been doing security forever, by the way, right? We don't take Microsoft's word for it. We installed 3 million agents on the Windows operating system and put firewalls in place, and here's a spam filter, and here's 20 other things. So why are we treating these other things differently? And the answer is there wasn't a solution. That's the answer. We weren't treating them differently because there was a solution we were all ignoring. We were treating it that way because we were unaware that one existed. That's why we're doing this webinar.
Well said. Yeah, so these are the 5 use cases that we're going to cover. So I'm going to go ahead and start with procurement. So the idea here is that you need someplace to start to get transparency data, and maybe help you make a decision on what to go with. Oh, I think I see a hand up. Kathy, do you want to go ahead?
For all questions, you can go ahead and use the Q&A function in the top panel.
Okay.
Yes, all participants are muted, so all questions can go in the Q&A, or if you have access to the chat, and we can handle questions from there.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Candace. I'll just wait for the question there. I'll continue on the procurement, but the idea here is, during that pre-sale cycle is a good place to ask for this information. Vendors are going to be more motivated when that sale is on the line. So to be frank, just getting this information from vendors is a good sign. They're providing you with a new level of transparency, and so they're kind of showing a maturity in their software development lifecycle by providing an SBOM or similar attestation. The idea is if they're giving you this data, you can see for yourself whether there are outdated components or high-risk vulnerabilities. Let's see.
The question is, can you please associate the use case to where this could be located in the SBOM report?
Sure. Yeah. As we go through, I can mention some of the data points that would be there. So I'll continue on with this pre-sales cycle. So on this slide, I've kind of got the who this might be relevant to. This might be good for your procurement group, or this function I know might be rolled into a vendor risk group or vendor risk management. Even architecture review might be part of this process to say, hey, we have SBOM data that shows us components. We don't want to allow Apache struts into our environment because it has a history of vulnerabilities. We want to review the included components for compliance. So knowing those components in advance can help support the lifecycle and horizon for updates. So to get started here, the idea is you want to include in your request for proposals or request for information, as those are sent, have your teams include language that says, as part of the submittal, we want you to include a software bill of materials so that we can analyze that information. You can also use this data to evaluate your security posture. So for an example we hear from clients is that when they're in this pre-sale cycle, that they're looking at maybe associated vulnerabilities on those products. If they're evaluating a couple of different products, they're not necessarily going with the product that has the least amount of vulnerabilities or the one that has the most. Having the most, that kind of makes sense. You don't want to go with the one that has a bunch of vulns that you found, but not going with the least kind of sounds counterintuitive. But the honest answer there is that if you've got a product that has like no vulns at all, it's probably because the vendor isn't really looking that hard enough. Every product has some sort of vulnerability associated. The idea is that we're able to look amongst our options there and pick the ones that are maybe the best for our environment, or maybe the ones that are in that middle zone of not the least, not the worst, but the one that fit just right. Kind of going through from procurement is contract negotiations. So that kind of follows on that pre-sale cycle. So during that process, you've gotten your SBOMs or maybe you've been able to get a trial version of the software where you can make SBOMs on your own. And you can compare between products. So you can factor in security or support timelines into your purchase decision. And the product your organization might choose might be one that has vulnerabilities associated with it. I find, like Tom was mentioning, like it's very likely that everybody's going to have something. So now is the time to try to address that in the contract. So you might put in your contract term that you found these 3 critical severity vulnerabilities that might need an update to a component. You can include that in contract language to say, have this remediated within X number of days, or ask the vendor to remove components that have a license that you don't permit. For example, if they have a copyleft license like GPL. And this part of the life cycle, this would also apply to the procurement and vendor risk stakeholders. Here to get started, you might want to create a playbook that makes it easy for your various teams to create, to include supplemental language based on the situation. So in this scenario, we assume the vendor did supply an SBOM, but maybe they didn't. So we should think of what to do in this case. So there may be times where the vendor can't or won't for whatever reason, but we can still use that contract negotiation process to, for example, request an alternate attestation. For example, asking them to attest that the product is free of known exploitable vulnerabilities, or requiring notification within, let's say, 90 days when a new one is found. Or you could put in a contract term that explicitly allows you to reverse engineer the software. That way you can better assess it yourself. Or if you can't get, oh, go ahead, Tom.
You're allowed to do that even if it's not in the contract.
Got it.
So, I mean, reverse engineering things is all about, it's all about intent, right? So if the purpose of you reverse engineering something, and they also call out in some contracts things like, is the goal to get to source code, right? Which, you know, is possible if you get down to different levels of things and they're using some open source stuff and all of that. But that's one angle. The other angle is the intention here to reverse engineer this software, firmware, device with the sole purpose of recreating that intellectual property to compete with that organization in the market? If the answer to that question is yes, then yeah, you're breaking the law, and that's like totally illegal. If the purpose is to reverse engineer something to identify the vulnerabilities and risks in these devices that lay the foundation of the very society that we all live and operate in, like, I'm not interested in your contract. So, because we're just going to do it anyways. So that's been litigated, right? Like, this is a thing that has been discussed, and there's case precedent here that highlights this. Thanks to, I believe, Rapid7, I think, is the organization that ended up getting this in front of like the Supreme Court once upon a time. Because we can all remember the days where researchers were, I don't know what the word is, ostracized and deemed to be doing illegal things, and finding, like, in reality, in many of the cases, they were finding vulnerabilities that no one else was able to, which made things better for everyone at the end of the day. But if you're doing this for the sole purpose of, you know, competing with this organization, yes, that's coloring outside the lines in a big way.
Yeah, so, great point, Tom. And I'll add an analogy here, which is like, if you're buying a car and you're looking under the hood to see if something's wrong with the vehicle, like, you're totally allowed to do that. You own it. You know, you're not trying to build the car or reverse engineer it. You're just trying to understand, is something wrong with the car. That's the same thing we're trying to do with code analysis, binary analysis, firmware analysis. Take your term, but it's the same exact thing.
Yep.
Again, in this contract scenario, you know, if you can't get an SBOM or an alternative attestation, remember that vendor is still transferring risk to you by picking certain components. So it's fair for you to ask for compensation for that transfer of risk. So this could be something, a negotiation on price, like a % discount, or it could be something like extended support or additional services. So this is all something that is a good exercise to go through, as think about using that data and then having a playbook of what to do when these issues come up during the procurement process. And I see in the chat, Vanu had a question. which is, has anyone tried asking vendors for this SBOM info? How is this process? So this is something that Fortress does on behalf of clients. And you can imagine for vendors, there's a continuum. Some of them are very mature. They have stuff built into their build processes, and they generate an SBOM already. They've probably been using them internally for their own purposes for years. It's newer for them to share with clients, but they are willing to do that, and many vendors have. Others, you talk to them and they'll say S what? They don't know, and that's okay. It is a process. And so one of the things that we do is work with vendors and say, if you need recommendations on how to do this or what tools to use, we can help get you started, and then help with sharing your SBOMs to our mutual clients. So thank you for that question, Vanu. Next up, we're going to move on to vulnerability management, and I'll hand that off to Tom.
Yeah, so I think I talked about this a good bit already, but I appreciate like the top line here, right? Which is really important. We're utilizing SBOMs as a component of inventory. Vulnerability management comes after that. And frankly, vulnerability identification comes before vulnerability management, right? So you have a number of different phases that come here. You have identifying a vulnerability based on a version. Then you have validating that actual code snippet exists or does not exist, which can be accomplished in a number of ways. And then you have questions around, are there exploits available for this vulnerability? Is it exploitable in the context of the device? Like, there's a number of questions that you can go down a pretty big rabbit hole here. What is kind of important here is giving folks as much context and ability to prioritize things in a way that matters to them. And obviously, both of our organizations provide recommendations on the best way to do that based on who you are, what your threat model looks like, things like that. Can you go to the next slide, Bryan?
Yes, here we go.
Beautiful. So, in terms of some different personas, IT and OT security, identifying vendor risk in these environments, which is something I have a lot of experience in, having been responsible for this at Department of Energy facility for some time. It's really kind of the foundation of what gave me the idea to do what we're doing now, as we didn't have a way to answer just basic questions like, does this device have this software component? Yes or no? And to not be able to answer that question about things that are responsible for insanely critical functions just did not seem to align with the appropriate level of risk that one was accepting as a result of not being able to answer that question. So, checking, doing the vulnerability validation, understanding, is there other data sources that can be leveraged here that call out this problem in a more significant way, right? You look at the known exploited vulnerabilities list. There's a lot of really amazing information that's being passed down from the government from, I guess we would call them third-party sources that are all not publicly available, which is an amazing, resource that the government is providing to folks, right? Some people have actually criticized that a bit, which I think is probably a bit off base, right? The federal government can't tell everyone how certain things are identified and found out, right? Sources and methods are an important thing. So, but having that additional context here is just really helpful. So. From a change management perspective, adding this intelligence to either the device update, the lifecycle management process, being able to say things, and this is just one data point that can be used. It shouldn't be the only one. But as an example, it's like, okay, we have 100 components. We know we can't update all of them because of time, energy, resources. Do we want to update the oldest component? Is that the one that we want to focus on? Do we want to set some baseline that says we want our average component age to be under 5 years, right? And do we not want to have our oldest component be at least 15, something like that? The problem is you can't even make those decisions right now. That kind of decision process is not available to most organizations because they don't have the data. And so also, using that to push back, it's one level of acceptability to have vulnerabilities in a component that is new or maybe current version minus 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it is. To me, it's a very different thing to have a component that's 20 years old and has a vulnerability commensurate with that component age. Because we're not talking about a vulnerability problem at that point. We're talking about a total lack of a software development lifecycle that has done much of anything in probably over a decade. That's the problem we're highlighting. And then we can talk about all the objections that one may encounter there, right? It's not being used, or it's not this and it's not that. And it's like, okay, that's fine. Those are great answers, frankly. Then let's delete it. Let's get rid of it. Why is it in there then? So once again, these are decisions that can't be made though without the visibility. Next slide. So, I mean, it's really a very similar process here. I think that this tends to matter a lot more for like certain components. Like if you think about something like OpenSSL, OpenSSH, these components and libraries that are ubiquitous all over the place that we find in every single device, in every single application. Being able to say, hey, where are we as it relates to components like that are probably things that you might want to think about prioritizing ahead of other issues due to the significant external risk that they can potentially provide.
All right, and then we'll finish up here with our life cycles on incident response. So we talked about this a little bit, and the idea here is that incident response can benefit from faster turnaround times and reduced impacts to operations. The idea is because you've already collected information on components, whether it's SBOMs or from code analysis, you have an accurate software inventory ready for when new vulnerabilities are discovered. So without this kind of information, you might have to resort to contacting the vendor and waiting to find out. Like we heard this happen during Log4j. We heard of large industrial base companies who had to resort to literally calling their vendors and asking, hey, do you have Log4j in there, and can you tell us? And this wait and see approach can take a lot longer. So the idea here is that you can use SBOM data to identify the presence of software components that may be affected by security incidents. So for example, Log4j was embedded in many different products, and it wasn't always able to tell easily if it was something that was in a product that you're using. And since you already have this data, which contains information on dependencies between software components, you can determine the impact and be able to prioritize remediation efforts. So that means you can respond more quickly and effectively and minimize any sort of damage or disruption that might be caused in the event of a vulnerability being able to be exploited in your environment. And Tom, do you want to add anything there?
No, I mean, just that I think to really kind of highlight, right? People are just totally unaware that they even have this ability. And so being able to know that you can answer these kinds of questions incredibly rapidly in cases where something like us is being utilized, it's just like a total game changer. I mean, people have spent hundreds and thousands of hours trying to determine if they have one software component. That's just like a really crazy state of affairs when organizations have the ability right now, for the most part, to track every single process that's running on every single Windows machine that's running in their environment, right? Like if you're using an EDR solution, as we all saw with the MITRE results, everybody got 100% this week. So congratulations, everyone. Shows a really valuable assessment was conducted. And so why have we allowed that level of visibility to exist, but not this other visibility, right? And I'll harken back to what I've said multiple times already, which is, it's not that I think the entire industry was just like this, like there just wasn't a solution yet. There was not a way. It's a different dynamic. You can't install agents on these things. Like the things that are typically available to you for other devices are not available to you on these for the most part, right? There's always exceptions, but that's what I would add.
Thank you, Tom. And so we're at the end of our presentation. We're going to open it up to questions. So if you didn't get to ask something earlier in the presentation, feel free to ask, and we can go back to slides, of course. If you're interested in learning more about more details into these use cases, we do have a white paper that's available. It's on Fortress's website. I also have a QR code there that'll send you to the right place. So feel free if you want to add any additional questions to the chat. I will say I'll go back in just a minute here. Kathy, I know you asked one earlier. I don't think I did a great job of answering it while we were doing the presentation, but I can go back and talk to some of these use cases and how and where the risk information might be in one of the reports that we provide. So I'm going to back up just a bit. So Kathy, I think you asked like what sort of like risk information in one of our reports might this be used in the different parts of the life cycle. So for procurement and contracting, you're looking for those just general component information and knowing if there's an outdated component. Like Tom said, there's a difference between something that might be a year or two old and something that's 15 years old. You're also looking for vulnerabilities, so we have a section on that information. And then depending on if it matters for your use case, there's also data on malware, licenses, and then we also provide information on foreign presence. So if you're interested in the provenance of where these components are coming from, that might be used in these first two for vulnerability management and incident response. I think that goes straight to having that vulnerability risk information. So not just that there's a vulnerability there, but also being able to narrow it down if it might be exploitable in your environment, or if there's an active campaign against that malware campaign, I should say, used on that vulnerability. And then on change management, that would go to the information on outdated components. So is this a major version behind, a minor version behind, and how many versions behind would it be? So hopefully that answered your question. And I see there's some new questions in the chat, so I'm going to scroll down here.
Yeah, I'm also just typing some answers, Brian.
Okay, cool.
Like, if she's looking at a Cisco SBOM, I mean, I'm not looking at it now, but I would probably operate under the assumption it's meeting the minimum requirements. So, things like vulnerabilities and other information might not be in there. I can't see it though, so it's total conjecture at this point. But that's the benefit of utilizing the services that Fortress provides on top of all of this, especially around like provenance and things like that, and what we provide around enrichment around the vulnerabilities and ways to prioritize those, et cetera.
Yep, and Kathy, I'd be happy to follow up with you and take a look at the SBOM that you're looking at as well.
Yeah, so this is a great question. If organizations are starting to build process around this and there are multiple competing SBOM standards, is that a concern? Hesitant to commit resources to working with a specific standard when this is still in the air. There's only 2 standards, and everybody, like anyone who's worth even having a conversation with, supports both of them. So one is Cyclone DX, which is supported by OWASP and Steve Springett, and then the other one is SPDX, which is ran by the Linux Foundation and was originally created. I believe she originally created it, Kate Stewart. So you have wildly competent people and organizations behind both standards, and so in terms of benefits of either one, the SPDX standard is ISO certified, so it tends to get more adoption internationally, I suppose. But Cyclone DX is a more modern format, I guess I would call it. I think that if you ask the people that are responsible for doing all the SBOM work, in particular at NetRise, they seem to prefer working with the Cyclone DX format. It just has a lot more flexibility. You can get into these holy war debates around whether or not you should include vulnerabilities or not, which is kind of a silly argument in my opinion. And because like in our platform, you just click a button. If you want to include vulnerabilities, include them. And if you don't, then don't. It doesn't really matter. So my point is you should not be having a conversation with anyone who is like, we only support this one standard. That's crazy. There's a million ways to support both standards. It's not hard. And that problem has generally been solved. So that should not be, there should be no hesitancy around that, in my opinion. But a great question.
Yeah, great question. I'll just add to that and say that that there are those two formats. As far as like, is there a tipping point of one or the other? Right now, no. They're both widely used. They both have good tooling support. I'll add from our perspective that SPDX was originally created to more focus on licenses. It's added more and more over time, but I would say that Cyclone DX is more focused on security use cases. So for our folks internally, we also like the Cyclone DX a little bit better. Part of that is also because if you're trying to work with these formats, documentation is really important, and the Cyclone DX ones are just excellent. Anybody could go on their website and read it and understand it. And Kathy, just following up on your question, both Fortress and NetRise support SPDX and Cyclone DX. So I'll just pause there for a minute and see if there's any questions. We're coming to the top of the hour. Let's see.
Long-term support current for embedded devices. I don't think it affects our efforts at all. You have a number of other third parties that are creating, pre-built frameworks for different things. You also have companies, developing like real-time operating system, kernels and things like that as well. But I mean, what's interesting is if you looked at this problem even a decade ago, you had a much longer tail as it related to the embedded system, like kernels and all this other stuff. Now, most stuff is just regular old Linux kernel. Like it's not even like a proprietary, like purpose-built embedded thing. And that's just because hardware's come a long way, right? You don't have to build this like crazy proprietary real-time operating system that only uses like this very finite amount of resources due to the chip that is running on the device and all that. So you find more and more these devices are just running full-blown, Linux file systems. That's a generalization as usual, but that's what we find. Even in things like satellites, ECU firmware in cars, things that were almost always real-time operating system based are now moving to kind of more full-fledged Linux systems. Do you think it will encourage more forks? I'm sure it will. Yeah, I would imagine.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and for coming to us. We hope you got some good content out of it. And if there's any follow-up questions or any other things that you'd like to ask us, please feel free to contact us. I've got both mine and Tom's emails up here. So Tom's is thomas.pace@netrise.io, and I'm bcowan@fortressinfosec.com. So again, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.